All right, let's bring in the next guest, who was appointed by President Trump as a senior advisor to the U.S. Agency for Global Media, where she is working to eliminate the waste, fraud, and abuse. Today, she joins us to talk to us about the Voice of America employee who has just been arrested for threatening Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene from the Voice of America studios. Get this, for the last 15 months. I'm happy to bring in Ms. Kari Lake to join us. Kari, really good to have you, my friend. So this guy, Seth Jason, 64 years old, Edgewater, Maryland, threatened MTG. We'll get into some of the things he said, but how did you discover this? How did they discover it?
Well, I discovered it a couple months ago, and I mentioned it in my hearing a few weeks ago that VOA had become a crime scene, literally a crime scene, and there was an investigation ongoing. I couldn't give a lot of the particulars as to who the victims were, but I made people aware of it during my hearing that threatening phone calls have been coming from Voice of America phone lines to a sitting member of Congress, her staff, and these threats were threatening them with their lives, kidnapping and threatening to kill them with a gun. Threats like he was going to show up at book signings with an AR-15 and kill them. So these poor people, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the great congressman from Georgia, her family, her staff, and their families lived in fear for 15 months from October of 2023 right until the day after President Trump was inaugurated. That's how long the phone calls were coming at them. And Capitol Police finally started to investigate it. They tracked it down to VOA, and they determined that it was Seth Jason. Now, he has not been convicted, but if he is convicted, I hope the judge throws the book at him. We can't have this kind of thing happening. This is a threat of assassination coming from inside of a taxpayer-funded building on taxpayer-funded equipment allegedly made by a taxpayer-funded employee. It's absolutely despicable.
No, we'll stay with allegedly, but the feds have been on him. Capitol Police have been on him. He sent voice messages from VOA studios to MTG. We've got our AK-47s. And the reason I'm reading this to you, Kari, is because it sounds like there's more than one person involved. We've got our AK-47s. You're going to get one between the eyes. Bam, bam, bam. And on and on. It threatened family members, threatened staff.
Terrible.
Is it possible there's more than one person involved in this?
Well, I don't know. That would be a question for Capitol Police, but I have reached out to the FBI, and I've asked them to look to see if any of the swatting incidents that were lodged against Congresswoman Greene, or frankly, anybody else, if they can track any of those back to VOA. I want to find out if there was more to this, if there were more threats made in the terms of those swatting incidents, that several of them came directed at Marjorie Taylor Greene. And that's another horrifying situation because it puts everybody at risk, including law enforcement. So I've asked the FBI to look into that. And if we find out something, I'll certainly let you know. But those are some questions for Capitol Police. My question is, did they start investigating right away? Why did it take more than 15 months to allow these calls to go on? When did the investigation begin? Because that's a long time for someone to be threatened with death coming at them. And it's just horrifying that it's coming from VOA. But you know what? Not totally surprising when you see what has been happening at this agency, the bias coming from the news operations at this agency, very pro-leftist, anti-America first. You've seen anti-American propaganda being put out by the news agency. So I guess I should say I'm not totally surprised that this would happen. I'm disappointed, though.
I spoke to MTG this morning, and she was supposed to be on today. Well, she's been called to votes. I'm not going to get into the details, but it's let's put it this way. She's glad that this person, if it's the right person, is caught. And unfortunately, there's a lot more. There are a lot of crazy, sick people out there who are just trying to do harm to people who are just doing their job. You know, MTG, we love her. She's just doing her job. Jeanine Pirro is the interim D.C. U.S. attorney covering this case, and she said they will throw the book at this guy if convicted. He's charged with influencing federal officials by threats. 1, 2, influencing federal officials' families by threats. 3, interstate communications with threats. And 4, anonymous telecommunications, including threats. So he faces up to 27 years if convicted. I wonder if at some point did the Capitol Police or whoever the investigators were know who this individual was, had their eyes on him, and let MTG know they had a pretty good idea who it was so that she could do her public events?
I don't believe so. I'm the one who informed Representative Green that this was happening. She was unaware of it when I talked to her about it. And then she reached out to Capitol Police and got more information. And when I called her and asked her about it, she had no idea that anything had been pinned down and that they were tracking somebody. You know, when they came in, apparently, according to the folks that they talked to at Voice of America, they had the recordings. They played the recordings for some of our staff, our security staff, and they did not recognize the voice because they hadn't been there as long as other people. So they recommended that the Capitol Police play those recordings to other people who'd been working for a long period of time at Voice of America, and I think they were able to help pinpoint who it might be, whose voice that was, and then, of course, you can check records to see if that person was actually in on the day the calls that were made. But what a brazen act to just go to phones around the building and make these threatening calls from the studios, from the control room. And then we found out that this suspect in this case was also a volunteer police officer with a Maryland police operation, a county police department. And so he was a volunteer reserve officer. They've since severed all ties with him after this, but just a really deranged thing to do. And if true, if he's convicted, a deranged individual.
Kari, now that we have you here, the news of the week, one of the pieces of news is in the Recision Bill that the funding, a lot of the funding for NPR and PBS has been pulled by Trump. How does that affect your world? Look, VOA is supposed to represent all Americans, right? It's supposed to be pro-democracy, get the word out around the world. This is what we're about. We're free. We honor liberty and freedom and individual rights and whatnot. How does this Recision Bill and the taking down of PBS and NPR's federal financing affect you at all? Does it?
No, it doesn't really, but it does show that the Trump administration is serious about cutting out wasteful spending and spending on biased news outlets where the American taxpayer shouldn't have to foot the bill. I'm glad that he pulled that funding from NPR and PBS. If they're as great as they say they are, they should have no trouble making it in the real world without the government subsidizing them, without the American taxpayer subsidizing them and their far leftist, biased programming. If they want to be biased, if they want to have a leftist lean in all of their news, then more power to them, but don't expect the American taxpayer to foot the bill. President Trump, at the same time, is working to help eliminate U.S. Agency for Global Media. I proved and showed when I had my hearing a few weeks ago that not only is it a colossal waste of taxpayer money, when it comes to our grantees, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, OTF, Middle East Broadcasting Network, they won't even show us where they're spending the money. We're funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into those outlets. I showed how Radio Free Europe almost hired 20 Russian spies. They were this close to hiring them. Without a tip, they would have hired 20 Russian spies. Only imagine what could have happened then. And we've shown that at Voice of America, we have no editorial control. They won't allow the management to have any editorial control. However, at the VOA Mandarin studios, they were meeting regularly with the CCP officials at the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., asking them for input in how VOA should be covering.
This is very fascinating to me. I only don't have a lot of time. What do you mean there's no oversight on the editorial?
There's an editorial firewall that prevents folks such as myself, who's in a top management position, from being able to call the newsroom and say, hey, you need to make sure we're covering America's story and not being anti-American.
What if they're out there saying stuff that's, anti-United States propaganda garbage like the socialist mayor in New York wannabe? You can't tell them to cut the crap?
Nope.
Well,
I can't.
How do you change the narrative? How do we make sure that we have pro-America types, obviously all sides represented, but how do we make sure that we don't have propagandists in there?
They slipped this editorial firewall into an NDAA piece of legislation a few years ago and took away all of our editorial control so they could go totally rogue in the newsroom and cover pro-CCP, pro-Iranian regime, anti-American stories, which, by the way, they have. And I can't pick up the phone, or top, political, appointee can't pick up the phone and stop them. Can you fire these folks?
Can you put your own people in?
It takes a lot of time. If you've ever tried to fire someone in the federal government, it's not easy.
we got a guy who knows how to do that. You're fired. He knows how to get Trump in there and clean that. VOA is very important. Go ahead.
We've shrunk down the agency by 85%, but this is another reason that editorial firewall needs to be eliminated. And this is a reason I believe we need to shrink it down and take what's left and put it under the State Department. The last time it was effective at telling America's story was when it was under the purview of the Department of State. Secretary Rubio, he can't even pick up the phone and call VOA if they were doing something anti-American and say, stop it. Or they could sue him.
Could Trump?
No, Trump couldn't either.
Wow.
This is how ridiculous it is. So the agency needs to be eliminated. President Trump's right. We've shrunk this down and we've right-sized it to where it's just what is statutorily required. President Trump has called for the elimination of the agency starting in the next fiscal year, which is October 1st. And I'm working very hard to make sure that happens. We don't need this out-of-control bloat, this relic of a news operation which used to tell America's story and now is more likely to be telling an anti-American story. It's time for this relic to go. And it's time for us to modernize and actually use our abilities to reach the world through other methods to tell our story than an old 1990s style TV that nobody is watching.
We want you to bring the story as that progressive. Let us know how things go, and we support you all the moves. You're right person in the right place. Kari Lake, thank you so much.
Thanks, Eric.